Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion on regenerative agriculture as a means for rebuilding nature and profit. A vital solution for both restoring nature and for driving profitability, regenerative agriculture not only holds immense potential for reversing environmental degradation, but also for supporting economic growth in agriculture. By focusing on restoring soil health, enhancing biodiversity, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, regenerative practices offer a pathway to a more resilient and sustainable future for agriculture. My name is Pratima Singh, and I'm a principal and the Food Imperative lead at Economist Impact, based in New York. The Food Imperative is Economist Impact's commitment to transforming our global food systems for the future. In today's discussion, we will explore how regenerative agriculture supports both environmental restoration and profitability, and how industry leaders like ADM are driving these efforts. Joining us today is Paul Sheets, Director of Climate Smart Ag Origination, ADM. In that role, he works with ADM's origination and sales team to develop, design, execute, and manage ADM's North American regenerative ag programs. Today, we'll cover the role of regenerative agriculture in sustainability, challenges in the field, and the scaling of innovative solutions. So let's dive right in. Paul, welcome to this discussion.
For inviting me. Happy to have the conversation.
Excellent. So, Paul, to start things off, let's start with a relatively broad question. The global food system is often highlighted for its significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Could you tell us a little bit about the scale of that? And also, how do you see regenerative agriculture as a key solution to mitigate that problem?
Yeah, in most of the reports, you'll see that food and ag contributes somewhere between 15 and 25% to your global greenhouse gas emissions. And why regenerative agriculture is so attractive today is that there's not necessarily a standard operating procedure when it comes to farming practices. When it comes to agriculture and the farmer specifically, we've leaned on them in times of need, whether that's food security needs in the 80s, fuel security needs in the early 2000s, and then now carbon security needs. And with regenerative agriculture, you have several different opportunities to adopt practices that ultimately can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also have a lot of co-benefits that are associated with them in the form of soil health, soil erosion, water quality improvements as well. And actually, if you look at what the farmer has done over the last 20 to 30 years, you've seen quite a bit of advancements up into this point of decreasing their overall carbon intensity while you have a growing population. And that's without a lot of private support or help or incentives or dollars that if all of a sudden that can change here for the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, you can see a lot of the work that we've done over the last 40 years accelerated in the next 10 to 20 years, which is ultimately what we need to be able to reduce those overall greenhouse gas impacts with the food and agriculture sector.
That's a great overview. Thank you for sharing that. And I think you mentioned, you're working with farmers directly, and we know that ADM has been supporting farmers in adopting these regenerative practices. It'd be great for the audience to hear a little bit about some of those examples and specifically those challenges that was faced by farmers when they were transitioning and trying to adopt this, and the kind of support they needed and how they overcame those barriers.
To be honest with you, it's taken a lot of work. So our work actually started in 2012. For any of your viewers that are not familiar with ADM, we are a grain handling, grain processing companies that takes commodities and turns them into agriculture ingredients that are usually used for a lot of the products that you can see on the shelf: fuel, feed, industrial products, etc. And we've been around for 120 years. And what we've done for 120 years is create markets, delivery periods, quality specs, but we haven't necessarily, outside of the last 10 years, had a more detailed conversation with farmers on understanding practices and what their environmental impacts were. So our journey started in 2012 because the first thing that we wanted to do, we knew that our business is dependent on the farmer. So we have to align on our goals with what the farmer's goals were ultimately. And our business is a lot of B2B type of business, so we have to align with what our downstream customers' goals were as well. And what we found through 2012 to 2021 is that between farmer and ADM and our downstream customers, there was a lot of alignment. Even though the language was, or the words that were used were slightly different, a farmer would say, define sustainability. Point one would be financial sustainability. So I want to execute practices or use products that are ultimately going to lead to profitability for a long term. Their bullet point number two would be when I invest in land, it's not just an investment for myself. It's not just an investment for my kids. It's an investment for my kids' kids. So I want to make sure I have practices that create a resilient crop and resilient soils, while downstream customers were focused on greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, soil erosion, et cetera. Same with ADM. Those things were ultimately aligned. And then when engaging farmers, a lot of the practices that we ultimately wanted to incentivize, there was a reason why farmers weren't adopting those practices. There's either a productivity or a cost concern associated with it. So what we wanted to do, along with our downstream customers, some of those early movers like the Unilevers and the PepsiCos of the world, is create incentives that offset those productivity and cost concerns. Because the truth is, there isn't a specific way of practicing. Every field is slightly different. In the States, a field in North Dakota is completely different than one in Illinois. Same thing you'll find in the UK and Poland. There's soil type differences, there's climate differences, there's commodity differences. But being able to provide financial incentives around specific practices or outcomes helps offset that productivity and cost concern associated with it. But it's not just cutting a check. There's also like an education and technical assistance expertise. So the one thing that we figured out through those 10 years as well is that we can't do it alone on the ADM side. We have to make sure we have partners that are experts in that conservation ag business, because I explained what we've been doing for 120 years. There's a lot of companies that's been doing conservation ag advising for decades. So in the States, we made sure we partnered with several different local conservation experts, whether that's Practical Farmers of Iowa. In UK, we partnered with Ceres Rural. There's Minnesota Soil Health Coalition. There's Kansas Association of Conservation District. There's American Farmland Trust. Several different conservation partners. But honestly, where the biggest impact has been is engaging some of the early adopters on the farming side of these conservation regen ag practices to help us educate other farmers as well. Because whenever we have a farmer meeting and it's a 4-hour meeting and you have a university expert, you have a conservation expert, you have a government expert, it tends to be quiet in the crowd. But the second you have a farmer panel of 3 farmers that have practiced cover crops for the last 5 to 7 years, engagement increases drastically of questions about operations and costs and productivity concerns. So that's what we've really leaned on over the last several years to be able to expand some of our regenerative agriculture programs, and keeping in mind that this is somewhat of a complex conversation just in providing the incentives, because it's a different agreement type that we've had with farmers as well. So there tends to be several questions and several conversations with farmers before farmers ultimately engage. Sometimes that can be a 12, 18, 24 month window from initial conversation to finally executed agreement.
That's great, Paul. I really love the really tangible, specific insights that you've shared. And as you say, I think we know quite well that some of those challenges aren't necessarily a motivation. As you say, farmers are custodians of the land and they want to do this for themselves, the future generations as well. It's a lot of the practicalities of it, the financing, the productivity, and providing financial incentives, but also partnerships, and very, very interestingly, putting farmers at the core of this, even when it comes to education, training, discussions, practicalities in engaging other farmers. I think that that's really interesting. I guess another sort of related question when we talk about, getting farmers on board and adopting these practices is around outcomes and, being able to show the benefits of regenerative agriculture, whether it's on productivity or the financial cost reductions and all of those things. Could you share a little bit about the role of data and technology, how you've used it in practice to support, understanding the impact of these practices, and then also to then, try and almost scale it as best as you can? Because I know you said every farm plot is different, every city, state, every place is different. But how would we use data and technology to achieve some of those benefits?
No, great question. So probably the one thing that we worry about the most in this space is the uncertainty around impacts or profitability of certain practices. Because whenever you talk about impacts, you could be talking about carbon sequestration in the soil, which has a level of uncertainty. You could talk about profitability per farm that could vary per farm. I think as an industry, the two things that we have to do is first acknowledge that there is uncertainty and then specifically use technology and data in the next several years to decrease the overall uncertainty and improve the deliverables to the farmers on what the positive impact ultimately is, but not be paralyzed by it, because that's what we see a lot of companies or partners ultimately do, is that the uncertainty is a piece that is really hard to overcome. The one thing that we should realize is we're really in early days when it comes to not only regenerative ag, but the term regenerative ag. When was the first time you heard that? It was like 4 years ago for myself. So it's relatively new. The practices aren't new, but the research and the data and the technology is new. And if we have the one thing that we've shown in the agriculture sector is when there's a need, there is significant innovation in every subject matter. And the one thing is there's obviously a significant need for reducing our overall carbon intensity, promoting regenerative ag, that the data that we're ultimately going to get over the next 5 to 10 years is significantly better than what it is now. So technology that we ultimately use is we have data collection partners that are really, really critical, because ultimately you have to get quite a bit of data from the farmer to feel comfortable about what your outcomes are. Those partnerships include Farmers Business Network, Bayer, Map of Ag, several different ones depending on which region we're specifically in. We also use a lot of satellite imagery as well to be able to verify practices, whether that's conservation, tillage, or cover crop practices, and then being able to use that technology as well when you're collecting the data. One of the really critical components of feeling comfortable about the data is having a robust QA/QC, or quality assurance quality control protocol, that makes sure if you're going to do a large scale program with thousands of farmers, and you might not be able to have like the specific touch of reviewing absolutely every single farmer, is having the technology to be able to flag some of your outliers for follow-up of what that information ultimately is. And again, recognizing we have uncertainty today. More than likely, there's always going to be uncertainty in this subject matter, but we can decrease the uncertainty over the next years. We're still in early days, and technology is only going to improve from here on out on being able to estimate outcomes, both from a carbon perspective, soil erosion perspective, a farmer financial perspective. It's only going to improve over the next several years versus where we are today.
That's really helpful, Paul. I think the point you made around being comfortable with uncertainty and being able to just thrive in it and collaborate, of course, as you say, with other stakeholders, and this is really critical. Final question. I want to just hear a little bit about ADM's very ambitious goals. I know we've talked a lot about practicalities, but there's a very ambitious goal of reaching 5 million acres of regenerative agriculture by 2025. What's the progress so far? How do you think you're doing?
We feel really good about it. I can tell you a couple of years ago, I would have been super nervous about a 5 million acre goal. We were able to achieve 2.8 million acres last year. Our goal this year is 3.5 million, and then next year will be 5 million acres. But the one thing that we've noticed is by being able to create scaling with farmers is difficult because it takes multiple conversations. So that boots on the ground component of scaling is really difficult, especially if you're going thousands of farmers. The great thing from an ADM perspective is we have the infrastructure that's already built, because we talk to farmers every single day. We have originators that are account representatives for farmers that are talking about markets or contracting types or delivery periods, whatever it may be. That existing infrastructure has really helped us. There's 220 originators across the US that's just having a slightly different conversation today. And you can feel over the last couple years where there's been consistent incentives and support about adopting practices or delivering outcomes, that farmers are interested in, especially in situations like you have now, which is a downturn in overall commodity price, where they're looking for any opportunity to increase their overall profitability, that we've seen significant change in farmers' interest level around these programs than what maybe we saw a couple of years ago. And I think that's because of consistent incentives, consistent messaging, and also an education piece that's associated with it as well. So we feel really comfortable about being able to hit our goal over the next couple of years, and hopefully we can grow and expand above the 5 million acres afterwards as well.
That's great, Paul. I'm very excited to talk to you next year and hear a little bit more about how you achieved that goal and keep this conversation going. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We've heard about the pivotal role of regenerative agriculture, the need for industry support with farmers and customers, and also how companies like ADM and innovative agricultural companies are using data and technology to scale solutions. And of course, collaboration across the agricultural value chain and also across different partners is critical for advancing these efforts. So, Paul, thank you very much for sharing your insights today. Very happy to speak with you. And thank you to everyone for joining this conversation on regenerative agriculture. Please stay tuned for the next session.